Welcome everyone to the Wild Neighbors Speaker Series. This is a collaboration between Travis County BCP and the City of Austin BCP. My name is Kate McCann. I work on the city side. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. On the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve, which is really a series of preserves that covers a broad swath of Western Travis County, with many different partners: the City of Austin, Travis County, the Nature Conservancy, the City of Sunset Valley, Travis Audubon, Wild Basin is part of this, as well as the LCRA. And so across all of this land, there are so many neighbors, and we often get questions from neighbors that are curious about the animals and the plants and the wildlands near their home. And so this is a chance to talk more in depth with experts about some of those subjects. A little background on the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve. This system of preserve protects several endangered species and really provides an umbrella of protection for all of our ecosystem. So you might be familiar with the endangered golden cheek warbler, the recently delisted black-capped vireo, and some of our endangered and rare karst invertebrates as well. Another view of the preserve. So this is Travis County, and you can see that the western half of Travis County is potential habitat for the golden-cheeked warbler. And the areas in light green are protected habitat as part of the preserve. And also represented on this map in the top left is that National Wildlife Refuge that shares our name, but is a separate entity. And so together, all of this protected land means that about 30% of the best habitat for the golden cheek warbler is protected. That means that this is an area that they'll be able to come to after their long migration from Central America and Southern Mexico, make nests and raise young. And it's really a great compromise because it means that all of the rest of that area, the area in blue, could be developed. And so it's a way for both our ecological and economic community to continue to grow. Sometimes it surprises people, all the different parts of Austin and Travis County that are part of the preserve. Some of my favorite places are part of the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve too. So while there are tracks that are really just for the birds or just for the cave bugs and are accessible through volunteering or through guided hikes, there are also a lot of areas that are publicly accessible most of the time, from Emmelong Park to Mount Bunnell to Commons Ford and Hamilton Pool. And so we encourage you, I'll post some links in the chat. When the time is right, again, come join us to volunteer or to come on a guided hike. Most of those activities are suspended right now during the pandemic, but we're really looking forward to when we'll be able to welcome more people back out on the preserve again. It's really a huge part of what we do and in telling the story of these ecosystems. And with that, I'll introduce you to our speaker, Kelly Sima, who's an urban biologist from Texas Parks and Wildlife. And I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll let Kelly, you pull up your presentation as I tell a little bit more about you. Kelly's been with Texas Parks and Wildlife since 1995, and she currently serves as the wildlife biologist in the Urban Technical Guidance Program for the Central Texas area. Her projects generally involve creating technical guidance, biological study, and outreach regarding wildlife habitat, exotic invasive plants, native urban adapted wildlife, including songbirds and coyotes, and engaging urban students of all ages in the study of nature. She earned her master's degree from Emporia State University, which is in Kansas, and she earned her bachelor's degree from Southwestern University, just up the road in Georgetown. So we're so grateful to have her here. Your experience matches just about perfectly with all that we're talking about in this Wild Neighbors series. Thanks so much.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much, Kate. I really appreciate the introduction and I appreciate being invited. Again, my name is Kelly Sima. I'm with Texas Parks and Wildlife as the wildlife biologist in the Urban Wildlife Technical Guidance Program. And so the presentation for today is kind of broad and kind of narrow. Let's just go ahead and dive right in. Let's see if, there we go. So just as an overview, a roadmap of where we're going, we're going to take a look at where we are here in the state of Texas, who's here, what kind of wildlife species are here, how to remain outdoor smart, just a few little tips and tricks, and really taking a look at how our values and ethics actually affect how have an effect and have consequences in the natural world. We all make our choices, and that's all that part of the presentation is all about choices. But first, let's take a look at where we are in the state. You know, the state of Texas is enormous, and we have a great variety of different habitat types from I believe this is coming up to Palo Duro Canyon up in the Panhandle west part of Texas, and to the East Texas piney woods. And if you haven't been to both sides of the state to look at the West Texas plains versus the East Texas piney woods, I really invite you to, because it's an enormous variety of habitats, to the Gulf marshes and estuaries that provide not only beautiful habitat in itself in its own right, but also provide the nursery for all those great big coastal species that we depend on in our coastal fisheries. To far west Texas, this is the Trans-Pecos, and the extraordinarily different ecosystem that is available there. But right here, we have our own little slice of heaven, and I saw a picture of Hamilton Pool earlier, Kate, in your introduction, and I included here because it's just this beautiful little oasis that's right here in the center, the heart of Travis County, or western part of Travis County, and it just brings together all the bits of habitat that I find just incredible. We have the beautiful clear water, the blue springs that we have there, the blue-green spring, which gets its color from the dissolved calcium and also the filtration through the calcium and the limestone. We get all the different species that are endemic to the area. It's just an amazing, beautiful place to go. But of course, it's an amazing, beautiful place to go in a sea of beautiful, amazing places to go. So let's take a look at some of the species. So the Balcones Canyonlands is actually a subset ecological region. It's a higher division of ecological region within the Edwards Plateau. And you see some species here that you don't see anywhere else, and wanted to say, or that are specialists here. So we have mountain laurel, which is an amazing evergreen tree that's been taken by the landscaping industry and just distributed all over the state. But where does it come from? It comes from right here in central Texas, the limestone hills. And in fact, you can see some really gorgeous specimens as you go higher up into the hills, into the really dry limestone. It looks like a tropical species. It's got the smell that makes you think that it's in the middle of the tropics, but it's actually a specialist of that limestone, that karst limestone habitat that is really, really dry and unforgiving. So that's one reason why it does very well in the landscape trade, because it can take a whole swing of very cold, very hot, very dry conditions and still look gorgeous. Lacy Oak is another one of my favorite species that's offered a little bit through the landscape trade, but not very much. I'd like to see more of it, because we have a tendency to think of live oaks as being the cornerstone tree of the Edwards Plateau, and it kind of is. But we have a number of different native oaks that are also here and also really beautiful. And Lacy Oak is one of them. I put a picture of the new spring growth because it's got a curious characteristic. It doesn't really have well, it has a little bit of fall color, but it really comes, I think, into its most beautiful time in the spring when it produces these pinkish, pink-green leaves as part of its new growth. The Texas Madrone, which is right next to it, is an incredibly crazy, weird species of tree. You see it here. You also see some close relatives over in California, but it's a smooth-barked tree, and the lower part of the trunk is actually red. And as the trunks branch off, that red kind of sloughs off, kind of like a crepe myrtle tree does, where it has that sloughing bark that comes off of it, but it's incredibly smooth and beautiful. It's a specialist to the area, and we just love it. Big Tooth Maple, what is the hardest state park to get into every year in the fall? It's lost maples, and the reason is Big Tooth Maple is a showstopper tree in the fall. It's got a lovely form, it's great habitat, but it's got these sunset red leaves that turn in the fall, just beautiful, beautiful colors. One of the surprises you might not be aware of is that we have cherry here in Central Texas as well, in the Balcones Canyonlands. We have escarpment black cherry. Escarpment black cherry is actually turning yellow right now, so you can go out into the field and find it. Look for the yellow trees. Other yellow trees would be a cedar elm, but the other tree that's turning right now is a flame leaf sumac. That's going to be a red color. Texas oak, also a red color. But if you see something that looks really, really strikingly yellow in the fall, that's going to be the escarpment black cherry. It's a beautiful tree. It's starting to be found in the landscape trade, so you can include it in your habitat as well, in your landscape as well. It's a lovely tree. So these are some charismatic mega trees, mega flora that can be found in the Balcones Canyonlands. So I mentioned that we have some species that are kind of specialist here. So we have in science we call a species that's found nowhere else an endemic, ENDEMIC. An endemic. Oh, I could just look at the slide. Anyway, Texas has 73 endemics that are found in Travis County. Okay, so Travis County has 73 of the Texas endemics are found here in Travis County. 64 of those are classified as rare or endangered species. These are beautiful species in and of themselves, and they are some of them that are very easily found. And you notice I've got this application pulled up. It's called iNaturalist, and it's one of the ways that we encourage, actually it's the main way that we encourage people to record their observations of anything that they find, whether it's common or rare. It helps us keep track of those data so that we can use them when we're making management decisions. For example, we find through iNaturalist, if you see up there, it says 93 species. This is in the Texas Endemics Project in Travis County. So while we officially have recorded only 73, I say in iNaturalist, it's actually another database. While we've officially recorded that many, in iNaturalist, through citizen observations, we found 93 different species. Why is that important? Well, if we didn't know that it exists here, we can't know how to manage for it. Also, if we don't know how common it is, we don't know whether we can delist it, hopefully. So, you know, the goal of conservation is to be so successful that we no longer have any endangered or threatened species, that all of our species are now up to their carrying capacity in the land, and we don't have to enlist them as threatened or endangered. So the recent delisting of the black-capped vireo is seen as a triumph in wildlife management circles, because it means that those species have been managed for correctly and have been observed consistently in a way that we know that that species is well on its way to recovery. So we're really, really happy about that. Anyway, so this is iNaturalist, and if you're at all interested in nature, I hope you do record. All it takes is a camera and either the app on your phone, or you can upload those species observations to inaturalist.org on the computer. Either way, it works out just as well. If you want to have some fun and look for what species are around you, you can just look on the map and see what observations have been made around you, and you can see what kind of wildlife are really in out your back door. So Travis County sits, so I was speaking of species richness, that is that the number of different species that you have in an area. And so biologists want to look at hotspots for species diversity and also richness, as well as putting in the factor of rarity. So if you have rare species that are abundant in an area, that makes it a hotspot. So, and if you have a lot of different species, more diverse species than other areas, then that also helps you become a hotspot. So the warmer the color on the map, the hotter, the more species rich, the more common the rare species are. And so you can see that Travis County lies within a belt of hotspots within Texas that extends throughout the United States. So it's something to be happy about and something to consider. But wildlife know that Texas is pretty special, and we do as well. So did I put, nope, I didn't, okay. This is a map that looks at the demographics, or the increase in population per county from now until 2020, from 2010 actually until 2020, and the percent change. So you can see that the high growth areas are going to be in Tarrant County, Dallas County, Harris County, the surrounding counties around Harris County, down in South Texas. I can't remember. I don't think that's Hidalgo County, but I can't remember exactly which county that is. And then the counties surrounding Travis County, Williamson County, Hayes County, and Bastrop County, as well as Travis County. So these areas are going to experience remarkable growth in an area that's already experienced remarkable growth. And why is that important? Well, the way that cities interact with the natural system really affects how that natural system responds. So cities and people have an effect on wildlife. And when we looked back at those endemic species that are found nowhere else but in Texas, and they're also found in Travis County, Austin spreads throughout most of Travis County. So we know that we have a big responsibility for managing those species in a way that's responsible and ecologically sound. So speaking of all those species, who's here? Now, I could do a whole class for a whole semester on what species are here, but let's just kind of go over some of the species that I'm pretty sure you can find if you have a little bit of good habitat. And we'll go by groups of species: birds, mammals, reptiles, and other groups. So anyway, the eastern screech owl. Eastern screech owl is a small screech owl, or a small owl. It's about this big. It's really not big at all. And it sounds like it's usually the thing in the backyard that sounds like, I don't know, before I knew what it was, I thought it sounded like the Headless Horseman. It sounds like a horse in that it has a whinny, a real interesting sounding whinny. And then after the whinny, it has a long call that's kind of a bubbling kind of call. But it's that horse whinny that is the weirdest thing. The cool thing about eastern screech owls, now they have two different color forms. This is the red color form. This is usually found a little bit east. And then there's the gray color form, color morph, that's found a little bit more in the west. But they can intermingle and they can certainly crossbreed. They're the same species, just two different color morphs, kind of like Labradors, or it could be black Labradors or yellow Labradors, just two different color morphs. But anyway, this species can be attracted into even very urbanized areas. All you have to do is provide either what we call a snag, which is a standing dead tree, which some people are understandably a little hesitant to do, or you can also put out a nest box for them. So the nest boxes for screech owls are about this size. They're about 2 feet tall by about 6 inches deep and 6 inches wide. And they're really easy to make, but you can also buy them online. Lots of people make them because they're just so easy to attract a screech owl to. And you can attract a screech owl right to the center of Austin, but I know this is Balcones, Canyonlands kind of area, so you can definitely attract them in the neighborhoods surrounding Balcones Canyonlands preserve areas. So why would you do that? Well, first of all, they're really cool looking. They are very dependable. They come through and they nest almost every year in the same nest box. Usually you'll have the same pair come year after year, and they'll raise a little brood there. And they eat all kinds of things that you would like to have them eat. So they'll eat grasshoppers, they'll eat very small mice, they'll eat beetles, they'll eat all kinds of things that are found in urbanized areas. They're not specialists so much as they are predators of small things. Another species you might find in central Texas is the eastern bluebird. Now, the eastern bluebird is curious. We have them like crazy out here in Bastrop. I live in Bastrop. but you also have them in Travis County as well. And what they really like most of all is an edge habitat. And we call an edge habitat an area where two different habitats come together. And they usually like something that's a little grassier, like a meadow or even a lawn, or right up against kind of something that's not so grassy, like maybe a woodland. And where do you find that kind of a habitat? You find it in urban parks. You find it in neighborhoods. You find it in cemeteries. You find it in developments. And these birds are fantastic at eating all kinds of bugs out of the area. So they're really great to have around. They're easy to attract. They're cavity nesters. They like to nest in either standing dead trees, again, difficult to find in urban areas. So you can also put out nest boxes as well to help supplement that resource. So if you've noticed, I've provided only 2 species because I don't want you to get overwhelmed with the number of species that we do. But both of these species are cavity nesting species. That is, they nest inside a structure, usually a standing dead tree or something like that. And the reason that's important is because that's one of the first things that we typically take out of an urban environment. So it's important to find those places where where there's no danger of human health. You know, you certainly don't want a tree falling down on somebody or a limb falling down, but you can provide those spaces in urban parks and other areas if you take off the limbs, the side limbs, because those are the most dangerous parts of the tree. And also if you put them away from walking areas, they can really make a habitat much, much, much more productive. Okay, but we're in Texas, right? So we got to talk about reptiles. The first thing everybody wants to find is the Texas horned lizard. That's the lizard all the way on the left. It is a friendly little lizard. Many of us have treasured stories of having seen them in our youth, but unfortunately they've become endangered here in the state of Texas. Maybe because of overharvesting, but also more likely because of red imported fire ants and other hazards that are found along the ground and in their habitats. So take a look at what they look like. So sometimes we just kind of see a thing and it just kind of melts all together, but take a look at the different parts of it. The horned lizard has a really flat, I don't know if you can see my mouse here. Let's see if I can't do this. Yeah. So has a really short nose. Look there, that nose, that rostrum area is very, very kind of flattened almost. Of course, there's the horns that give the horned lizard its name, and you see them all along the lateral side of them, all along the back of them. But hey, let's take another look right here. Look at this tail. It's really, really short. Now there's different species of horned lizard. There's Texas horned lizard, there's short horned lizard, there's longhorn lizard, there's a couple of the different ones. But the tail in all of them is going to be short always. Sometimes it's shorter than this, sometimes not very often is it much longer than this. This is about as long as it gets. So I say that to say this. I get an awful lot of calls from people who say that they've seen a horned lizard, and that's great. I ask them to take a picture of it so that we can enter it into iNaturalist. And whatever species you find, again, as I said, whether it's common or rare, we like to see them in iNaturalist. The more data, the better. But this is often the creature that gets confused for the horned lizard. Notice it's got really rough scales. They're kind of spiky scales, and that's why we call it the Texas spiny lizard. But it's different from the horned lizard in that, look at this rostrum here. It's got a nice long lizard looking head. You know, it's got a really long nose. It's not got that flat shape of the horned lizard. There are no horns. They're not actual horns, you understand. There are no little horns coming off of the back of the head of the Texas spiny lizard. That's another clue. And look at this glorious long tail. So this is the thing that tells me right away that this is a species that's different from the Texas horned lizard or any other horned lizard, is that long, glorious tail. But they are fat, and they are, they're kind of wide looking. They're found throughout Travis County. They're very friendly. They're shy. They're usually, they're one of the ones that you'll hear running through the leaves really noisily. So you're wondering what on earth that is, what kind of dinosaur is about to get you. It's just usually the Texas spiny lizard. There's also a couple of little skinks that it could be as well. Also, whenever I get calls to the office about a snake for identification, 95 times out of 100, it's going to be the Texas rat snake. Texas rat snakes, so if you're taking a look here, you can see that it's a full-bodied snake that's a dark coloration. It's got round pupils if you want to get that close to it, as most non-venomous snakes do, but that's not always the case, and sometimes it can, in low light, vertical pupils can look like long pupils, so or round pupils, so you don't want to use that as a characteristic. But what you can do is take a look at this pattern on the back. Now, at first glance, you might think rattlesnake because it's got a pattern on the back, but actually take a look and see that these lines right here kind of remind you of a fence. Think about a chain link fence. That pattern is consistent on almost all Western or Texas rat snakes. They're the same species. So I'm going to try to see if I can't erase that so that you can see those a little bit better. There we go. So take a look at that pattern. It looks like a chain link fence. That's your real good indication that that's a Texas rat snake. There are other characteristics as well, but that's always the one that I kind of go with. I key on that and I'm like, oh yeah, that's what it is. A lot of times you'll see them, let me get the ink again. A lot of times you'll see them with what looks like a little mask on the front, not on the back here, but just on the front. And that sometimes kind of tells me too. And also they kind of get kind of muddy. So also one other thing, let me erase one of the markings here. Oh well, anyway, so we call these labial scales here. There's no lines on those labial scales. If there were lines on them, vertical lines like that, that would indicate that it was probably a water snake. Again, a non-venomous water snake or non-venomous snake that is found in the water. And I just group them all together as Nerodia. That's the genus name because I have a hard time telling them apart. But there's the plain belly water snake and the yellow belly water snake. And they are both grouped under the genus Nerodia, and they are harmless non-venomous water snakes that are oftentimes confused for cottonmouth. But anyway, this is the snake that's most often found, is the Texas rat snake. This little lizard over here is the one that I usually find when I'm gardening because I like to hang out in leaf litter and dirt piles and usually wherever I'm trying to put my shovel. This is called a, hang on, let me move this over here. This is called a spotted whiptail. Okay, so the tail that goes all the way, it's this huge, long, narrow tail, but it doesn't have to have the tail. Sometimes in predation events or they'll lose their tail. But look for these long lateral lines that run along their body from head to tail, along the side of their body. And then look, if you look really, really closely, you can see it's kind of dotted along the sidemost of those lines. And that tells you that that is a spotted whiptail. Now, there are a couple of other species that have lines like that, but the most common one that I've found in Travis County is the spotted whiptail. We also have what's called a 6-line race runner. That's a totally cool lizard that has a similar look to it, but the spotted whiptail is the one that I find most often. Okay, so Texas mammals. So these are not the most common mammals. The most common mammal would probably be things like skunks, striped skunks, what else? Possums, various rodents like house mice and deer mice and cotton mice. Cotton mice are crazy common in Travis County. Cotton rats are really cute little rats that don't get into your house. They stay outside all the time. I've never found one that comes inside. Whereas a house mouse, of course, will. But here are some more of the fun, interesting mammals that you might find. Gray fox, it's really it's not biologically a cross between a cat and a dog, but behaviorally and physiologically, it kind of is. It's got very feline characteristics to it. One of those characteristics is it loves to climb trees, does very, very well. In fact, it's one of the top mesopredators, which we call a middle predator in Travis County, is the gray fox. So it likes to eat small birds, snakes, eggs, whatever it can get its little teeth on. And actually its biggest competitor is going to be the coyote. And also the red fox when they come in competition. But usually gray fox can outcompete a red fox, but it has a hard time competing against a coyote. Coyotes are pretty formidable. And then the other little guy is one that very few people ever see, but they're pretty common here in Travis County. It's called a ringtail. Sometimes people call them a ringtail cat. It's a relative of the raccoon. Notice the stripy tail that comes down, but it's really, really long, a little different from a raccoon. And of course, the body looks like a domestic cat. It is not a close relative of a domestic cat or any other kind of cat. It's not felid in any sense. It's a procyon. It's a raccoon family member, but it is it's such a friendly, curious, and timid little guy that in the past people kept them as pets because they are really good at catching rodents and other house pests. But they're also really friendly, so people keep them as pets in the past. I do not recommend it. It's much better to keep a cat inside than a ringtail, and also that wouldn't be entirely legal, so you wouldn't want to do that. But they're really cool little species. You don't see them because they're very secretive. They're found usually in the dusk and in the evening. You don't ever see them. I know this one is hanging out during the day, but you don't ever see them during the day. And they like to hang out in trees. They're arboreal, that is tree dwelling, and they really, really like to have to hang out in cavities in trees, like those standing trees I was talking about earlier. So a lot of times we talk about pollinating species, and whenever we talk about pollinating species, most people's thoughts turn to bees. Now, this is a native species of bee, American bumblebee, but we also have European honeybees, Western honeybees, they're called. Those are those species that were domesticated for honey production. But they are a real generalist species. They're not really all that great at pollinating. Our native species are actually much better at pollinating. So whenever people sound the alarm about the collapse of bees, that is a big deal, because people earn a living through honey production, and people earn a living also through honeybee pollination. Honeybees may not be great pollinators, but they all come back to the same hive, and they're transportable. So that makes them really good at pollinating commercial crops. So that's important. But we have I think 161 different species of native bee that are actually specially adapted to pollinate different species of plants. So you have some species that pollinate like this kidneywood, you have other species that pollinate like foxglove and penstemon, and you have different species that pollinate different ways. And they're really, really very valuable. But there are other kinds of critters that produce, spread pollen among different plants. For example, hummingbirds. Hummingbirds are really good pollinators of a few different species. You see it's pollinating right there. That's actually from my garden. It's a, obedient plant. And it was doing a great job of pollinating there, but it also does a great job of pollinating things like Turk's cap and coral honeysuckle, and a whole bunch of different plants that are really, really responsive to hummingbird pollination. They tend to carry the pollen right there on their forehead. So a lot of times during the season, you can see hummingbirds with like a dusting of pollen on their forehead if you look closely enough. The next species down is one that we kind of shrink away from. It's a type of wasp. We have a ton of different wasps. There's only a few that are actually aggressive species. So we do have the red wasp that's kind of aggressive, and the yellow jacket, also aggressive. But this little guy, and the name escapes me right now, it's in the notes. It is a wasp that is completely benign. It can sting. It has the ability to defend its nest, but it really doesn't ever do it. So these are really effective and prolific pollinators of different species of plants. We also have flies, beetles, and other things that go from plant to plant, eating nectar and also eating pollen. Pollen has a high protein content to it. So we have a lot of species that eat that protein resource and then spread it among different flowers. And last on the list, and I know they're everybody's favorite, is the butterflies and moths. Now, they do a little bit of pollination, but I'm sorry to say they're really not significant pollinators. So whenever we're thinking about creating habitat for pollinators, butterflies are a great, also ran. They're a wonderful thing to have in the garden because they're beautiful. They attract a lot of attention. They're fun to show kids. They're fun to photograph. They're fun to look at. But mostly they don't do a whole lot of pollinating when they're moving from plant to plant. They don't have any specialized structures like a bee does, or even like a wasp does to move that pollen around, or even that a beetle might have. So they're fun to have in the garden, but they're really not the big pollinator. So anyway, how are you going to attract? So now you've seen the value of these wildlife species. They're beautiful birds to have in the garden. There are butterflies. There are all lizards and frogs and everything to have in your garden that would be appropriate. And I'm not saying you want a garden for mountain lions. That's not at all what we're saying. There are species that are appropriate and species that are less appropriate for urbanized areas. But you want to do something for them. So what can you do? Well, a lot of times people will put out food for wildlife. But that's a thing that we got to be really, really careful with, because putting out food for wildlife species has a consequence. So one of those consequences is you get a large grouping of animals in one space where they might spread disease or might have different, spread different funguses and also some bacteria that can be spread from animal to animal. Chronic wasting disease, for example, in ungulates, that's a really scary disease among white-tailed deer as well as other species. But one of the ways that it has spread is at feeding stations. So it's a thing that we need to be very, very careful with. So what would really be better from a habitats perspective is to provide beautiful native plants that are well adapted to the area, that can provide all kinds of benefits, not just calories, but also holding the soil, producing oxygen, helping transpiration, cool the soil, cool the air, but also provide those calories, the nuts, fruits, berries, nectar, pollen, all those valuable benefits for wildlife species, and in a way that's a little bit more spread out, a little bit more natural. You never have to clean it. You never have to refill it. It's always there. It's always good and dependable for wildlife species. So when we're providing food for wildlife, when you're providing that habitat benefit of food, that's something to consider. Another thing that we like to provide is water. Water is non-caloric, so it's not going to affect the reproductive rate of wildlife species, and it's essential for all wildlife in the hill country. Now, I put a really beautiful example of a landscape element with water in it, but I only do that because it's gorgeous and I like to highlight it, and it's also the cover of our book. But it also lets me show you a couple of elements that are really important in providing for wildlife. One is an easy access point. Look at this little beach that's nice and sloped, and it's easy for birds and other animals with small legs to get in, and more importantly, get out. Because if a wildlife species came from this side, let's say a turtle, and dropped down into the water right here, how hard would it have been if you ever tried to get out of a water element with straight sides? It's really, really difficult to do. So you want to make sure you have an easy entrance and exit area. Also, look at all this nice native vegetation that's around it. So it's within flitting distance, really close that wildlife can get into it, but it's not so close that it kind of covers over it. And why is that important? Because not just the animals getting water are going to access those plants, but also predators. So you're going to have house cats or other predators that might try to take advantage of this watering hole, just like they would out on the African plain, right? They would use that opportunity to get some prey themselves. So we want to make sure that we have vegetation that's pretty close, but not too close. And also notice how clean and beautiful this water is. You don't want stagnant water. You want to make sure the water is moving, because stagnant water attracts things like mosquitoes, and you don't want to do that. The water is moving, so it's got less opportunity to get algae buildup in it. And it's got a high oxygen content, so it's good for all wildlife species as well. So those are elements of good water design in the garden. You can do it with a bird bath. You can do it with a little tin underneath the condensate pipe of your air conditioner, which I have one. I wish I could point the camera out so you can see it, but right outside my window, I've got the air conditioner condensate pipe. And so when the air conditioner turns on, water condenses in it and it drips out of the pipe slowly, and it goes into a little bird bath that I've set up right there, which is kind of neat. I get to see usually cardinals and wrens are using it. So shelter. So a lot of times when we want to put shelter for wildlife, we put out a nest box like this one, which is cool, but many wildlife who use that would really rather be using a standing dead tree, which we talked about a little earlier. So those are the elements of habitat. I'm mindful of the time, and then I'm really getting to be close to the end of my time. So I just want to let you know that, or I want to kind of scroll through these really quickly. And talk about being outdoor smart. We face all kinds of dangers in the outdoor environment. We want to make sure that we pay attention to those, but we know that there's benefits to them too. So all we have to do is make sure that we understand the rules of the road. So I was invited to come out to this area. They had seen a snake and they wanted me to identify it. So in the comments, can you tell me what this is? Okay. So that is I was talking earlier about the Nerodia species, the water snake species. Oftentimes when people see a water snake, they think it is a cottonmouth. Most of the time it isn't, especially in Travis County. We just don't have a lot of cottonmouths snakes, but it is a Nerodia, non-venomous. But what are some good smart things you can do? Make sure that you wear shoes. This is Texas, and a lot of people get bitten when they're walking in their backyard without shoes. Look where you put your hands. Make sure that when you're climbing up rocks, don't put your hand somewhere that you can't see where it's going. Step on top of large logs and rocks, not beside them or over them, because a lot of times this snake will be hanging out right on the inside of that rock or log. And never harass a snake. That's usually when you get bit. One last thing, and then I'm going to go ahead and stop. And I know the video is choppy, but my tomatoes were getting hammered by birds, so I put bird netting on them. Guess what got caught up in the bird netting? That's a hognose snake. It's completely beneficial. It's non-venomous. It's a sweet little snake. And it needed to get out. So one thing we recommend is to avoid putting, this is the outcome. So yeah, that's a puff adder, or people call them puff adders, but they're actually called hognose snakes, completely friendly garden frog eaters. In fact, that one looks like he's a very well-fed frog eater. So consider what kinds of things we're putting out in the environment, like this, which is an erosion mat, and consider what kind of an effect that kind of element might have on other wildlife species. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop there. We can talk about coyotes in the question and answer if you like. We could talk about feeding wildlife in the question and answer if you like. And I'll go ahead and pitch it over to Jaya. We'll talk about feeding raccoons if you like. I misjudged the length of this presentation by a lot.
That was great, Kelly. Thank you. So we have about 2 or 3 questions right now. If anybody else has other questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box.
I saw that somebody raised their hand too. I don't know if they got their question answered.
Yes. And yeah, David, if you have a question, you can go ahead and put it in the Q&A and we can get to it as well.
Okay, hit me.
All right. So first question we have is from Pamela, and she asked, do the owls scare the wild birds away?
Okay, really good question. So, do the owls scare the wild birds away? Well, they're part of the environment. So, um, they're going to avoid little small prey, potential prey would be things like hummingbirds and maybe ruby-crowned kinglets and really small birds because the screech owls are really, really small. But they're part of the environment and they have adapted ways to avoid predation. So there's always going to be some predation, of course, because that's the way it has to happen. But they're going to be less successful more often than not. So they have to have a lot of attempts before they're successful. So I said all that to say this. Yeah, they're going to affect the behavior of the wildlife, and that's a good thing because wildlife, if they're not in a feedlot, they're not in a zoo, they're out in nature, and so engaging in different types of predation events, that's not a bad thing. That helps keeps them on their toes. It helps control reproduction. It helps control pest status of different species. So yeah, they're going to affect it, but that's not a bad thing.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, and so we have a question from Maria now. And the question is, how do we convince people to stop putting their cats outside, especially at night, to where they're vulnerable to coyotes, etc.?
Okay, so if I had the answer to that, I would probably have been more successful in my job than anybody else in the world. So cats pose a really interesting thing, a really interesting problem. They are a companion animal that are very valuable, very emotionally attached, or people are very emotionally attached to them. And so, of course, they want to keep them healthy, right? And they want to keep wildlife safe. I'm sure everybody wants to have a good, healthy environment, as well as good and healthy, pet cats. So one of the best way that I've ever had, the most success I've ever had, is to talk about this as a pet responsibility issue, because it is. It's, you got to pick your angle. That's the angle that I think resonates with most pet owners. That is, pets that are left outdoors, whether they're cats or any other thing, they have short lives. Usually, total outdoor cats usually only live 3 years, if that. They have an average lifespan of about 3 years. Living inside, you can expect 16 years, you can expect 18 years, but I think the average is about 14 years for a cat that's kept indoors. They're exposed to disease, they're exposed to cruelty, they're exposed to danger by car. Coyotes, I don't want to say that they actually do a lot of predation, because while they might, especially if a cat is injured, cats are really hard prey to take down for a coyote. They scratch. They're very agile. They run up into trees. So coyotes don't really catch them very often. A lot of times when you do see them in food studies of coyotes, they generally are. It's hard to tell whether they were caught or whether they were hit on the road, and that the coyote's just eating carrion. But that's unpleasant. Go back to say, people want safe cats, right? They want to keep their feline safe. One of the ways that they can do that is to keep them indoors, keep them spayed and neutered, and keep their vaccinations up to date. Those are the 3 biggest things they can do to keep their cats safe. Feral cat colonies, not only are they dangerous for cats, they are terrible for wildlife. They're very prolific areas of disease spread. It's difficult to capture cats for annual vaccinations. They're not really a good solution. The best solution is to trap a cat and to offer it for adoption. If it's unable to be adopted, it's not humane, in my view, to leave it outside. That's a whole lot more information that you need, but I can't see your faces, so I can't see how you're reacting. I'll stop.
All right, thank you, Kelly. Our next question is, will a recording of this presentation be made available? And yes, we are recording it, and the link to where it'll be posted afterwards is in the chat. We have a question from Dawn. Any recommendations for learning to landscape for wildlife and beauty?
Yeah, I've got a great recommendation. I've got a book somewhere around here called Texas Wildscapes Landscaping for Wildlife, which is a fantastic resource. But also, there's a book by Sally and Andy Wazowski called Texas Native Plants Landscaping Region by Region. It's a fantastic resource for for native gardening. And I say native gardening, and sometimes people think that I'm talking about like wild gardening. I'm not. It's however you like to garden, whether it is a very formal English garden or a more rough and ready, natural looking garden. That's really all aesthetics. But native gardening that's good for wildlife can be had in almost any style. Those are two really good books. There are also seminars that are available through the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. And also sometimes the city of Austin does Grow Green seminars as well. And they go down deeper into the weeds, as it were, of the really specifics of natural gardening or wildlife gardening or native gardening and landscape design.
Okay. We have an anonymous question. What can we do about titmouse birds pecking on car windows?
I would ask Anonymous for a little bit more clarification. So I will say, while Anonymous is entering in some more information, birds see the reflection in windows. Titmice is a new one to me. It's usually cardinals that do it and blue jays that do it really bad. And I had a terrible problem with a eastern bluebird that could not leave my window alone. And so I can post a video link in the, where did you say that this will be posted again?
So if you post the link in the chat, we can share it.
Okay, I'll do that when we, maybe at the end of the thing, if you remind me. There's a video that I did on how to, one easy way to dissuade birds from hitting windows. And one of the ways is to use a yellow highlighter and to draw a grid on your window very quickly. You can't see it. You need to make sure the squares are about 2 inches by 3 inches or thereabouts. And the birds can see it very, very well, but we can't see it at all. Now, there are some commercial products that do that as well, that have ultraviolet or fluorescent lines in them, some films that you can put on. Usually stickers don't work very well unless they're like consistent. So there's some stickers that are like dots that go over the window, and that helps a lot. So that helps not only with the fly-throughs that are devastating to the health of birds, but also to the annoying little pecking. And the pecking, I was able to get my eastern bluebird to stop pecking at the window with the yellow highlighter trick.
All right, thank you. Our next question from Kathleen asks, does a coyote with mange suffer?
Okay, so the question is, does a coyote with mange suffer? Yeah, it's a terrible disease. It's something that some of them seem to pull out of and some of them don't. It's very itchy. It's if you've ever had a pet dog that has had mange, they're not comfortable. They have reduced survivability just because of how sick they get. It's harder for them to catch prey. It's not good at all. It's not good for them. But they can survive it, and it's just part of the ecosystem. But it is definitely a limiting factor for their survival.
Our next question from Ruth: any animals that eat fire ants?
Gosh, I wish there were. So red imported fire ants are an exotic species that came from overseas. They came in ship ballast, I think to Florida first, and then they've been marching their way upward and with their destruction ever since. Some birds will eat them, but they just don't do they don't do any real damage to their populations. There's so many of them, and they can't get the queen. There's not a termite eating or a larva eating animal like a aardvark or anything that'll come through and eat the queen or the nest. But what you can do is you can not mow your grass so short, not yours. I just mean people in general. If they mow the grass a little bit taller, and if they have more canopy cover, that is taller trees, mature trees, the more trees you have apparently, and the taller the grass you have, the fewer fire ants. That doesn't mean you're not going to have any fire ants, you will. But that has a tendency to reduce their populations. What will increase their populations is if you mow really, really short, like golf course short, like an inch or inch and a half, that really starts to, and also if you graze goats or cattle on your property, which most people don't in their yard, but that does have a tendency to increase the number of mounds per acre.
Thank you. We have a couple questions from Michelle. How do we attract owls to our property? And does spreading wildflower seeds attract bees and wasps? And then are there any plants that attract or ideally send away mosquitoes?
Okay, I'll see if I can remember. What was the first one again? The first one was?
How do we attract owls to our property?
Owls. Okay, so attracting owls to your property. Almost all owls require some sort of cavity in which to nest. The exception is burrowing owls. They dig down into the soil, and we do have those here, but not too many in Travis County. We do have some. But most owls really are looking for mature trees, standing dead trees that have cavities in them, or standing trees with cavities and they're still alive. Those trees are still alive. So they need kind of older growth, maybe a little bit more messy growth. That is fantastic for the owls. If you don't have any standing dead trees, you can create one either by taking a log, which sounds extreme, but I've seen people do it. They take a tree that was cut down somewhere else, they erect it in their own yard, they support it so that it's not going to fall down, and then they let the woodpeckers and owls just go crazy with it, and it's really pretty cool. You can also build nest boxes. They like that as well. The biggest thing, however, is to avoid using rodenticides. Rodenticides get into the bodies of rodents, obviously, that's what they're supposed to do, but those rodenticides don't always kill immediately. And so what does any predator target first? They target those sick animals, right? They target the sick prey. Well, if a mouse or rat is ingested rodenticide, it will appear sick right before it dies. So the bird will be more likely to take that animal. So why is that important? Because that rodenticide then builds up in predators, and over time it can create a lethal situation for those predators. So we've seen buildup of rodenticide in coyotes, in owls, in mountain lions, in raccoons, all kinds of species that have over time, not only is it lethal for them directly just from the poison, but also over time it can make them more susceptible to disease. And we mentioned mange is actually comorbid. They say it happens more often in areas that have higher rodenticide use. So mange in coyotes and also dogs happens more frequently in areas that are using rodenticide. You had a bunch of questions. Will spreading seeds attract pollinators? Well, of course, you have to make sure that they grow. They will not, so it will create an area. If you put out native species, it will create an area that is much more welcoming and provides more resources for pollinators that include, for all kinds of pollinators. Kind of depends on what species you put out. Now, what was the last one, Jaya? The last question from Michelle.
That is, are there any plants that attract or send away mosquitoes? And that is actually, our last question, because we're going to wrap it up.
Okay, mosquitoes. So the best thing you can do about mosquitoes is eliminate all stagnant water. There are some plants, usually they're exotic plants. American beautyberry is actually a plant that has some compounds in it that repel mosquitoes, which is pretty cool. But I've got beautyberry all over my yard and I still get mosquitoes. What they are looking for is stagnant water in which to breed. And it happens that the most prolific area for breeding is an area that we don't usually think of, and that's our gutters. So our gutters usually collect leaves in it. It collects the dew rolls off in the morning, the fog. This morning was incredibly misty. There was water all over the place. It runs into the gutters. There's not enough of it to run out through the drain, but it collects there in those leaves. And when the water collects in those leaves, it's stagnant. It stays just long enough for a mosquito egg to go through its larval hatch cycle and emerge from its first hatching. So into the mosquito form. So the best thing you can do is look for and eliminate stagnant water in your property. If you've got mosquitoes in your backyard, chances are you have stagnant water somewhere on your property. They're not real good flyers. They're pretty weak flyers. So they're not going to be coming from ponds that are down the street or anything like that. They're going to be coming from areas that are very close to you. I have really enjoyed my time. Thank you for inviting me. I hope you're able to get some of our questions answered. I should have put my email address. Here it is. Hang on. There it is. My email address is right there. If you'd like to contact me, I'm delighted to answer any questions through email. And thank you for inviting me one more time.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Kelly.
It's my pleasure.
And this is Johanna from Travis County Balcones Canyonlands Preserve. I want to say thank you so much, Kelly. This was really interesting and wonderful. And we're going to be sharing in the chat right here some websites that people can check out for more information about the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve. And they have your contact information as well. So it seems like there's a lot of interest and a lot of curiosity about this topic. So folks are encouraged to follow up with Kelly or with us. We are here to answer your questions and help us all live, peacefully with our wonderful wild neighbors and to just enjoy as much as we can this amazing region that we live in. Thanks so much again, Kelly. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, everyone.